Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members. I'd like to make a start. I was actually waiting for the clock to chime for 6 o'clock, but it obviously hasn't, so we'll move on. Just a couple. And good evening and welcome to this session of the Planning Committee. I have been advised there are no fire drills planned for tonight, but if alarm does sound, Mrs. Snook, who's on my right here, will ascertain the situation and provide further instructions. I would remind you that this meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on Maidstone Borough Council website. But will anyone else be recording or filming this proceeding? Because just so people know. No? Okay, thank you very much. If members who are using mobile phones or tablets, please ensure that these are on silent or switched off and are only to be used in regard to the business on the agenda this evening. Now, before I move on to the agenda, I know I've been looking at social media and various things. I know there's one item on here that is sensitive and an item that is important for a lot of people. But I would ask you that you respect this committee, respect the members and particularly the officers who are presenting their reports. As is very important, this is a place of serious discussion and we will debate the issues. But I do request and require that people don't clap and don't wave banners because, as I said, this is a meeting that will carry out very serious discussion on a number of agenda items. So I hope you will respect that, and thank you very much. I will now turn to agenda item 1 of the agenda. And there's apologies for absence. Are there any?
Thank you, Chairman. We've received apologies from Councillor Round.
Oh, right. Okay, that's noted. Councillor English.
Apologise that I will undoubtedly have to leave well before the end of the meeting due to a work commitment. Normally I can get out of this, but the Post Office take a dim view of people not going into work in pre-Christmas period.
Thank you, Councillor. I do understand, and it's fully understood. Yes, okay. Notification of substitute members. Councillor Burton.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Burton, substituting for Councillor Round.
Thank you. Notification of visiting members.
I'll move for item 15, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Councillor Robertson.
Yes. All right. Okay. Councillor Springett. Okay. Thank you. That is certainly noted. Are there any items withdrawn from the agenda? I don't think there are. No? So no items withdrawn. The date of the adjourned meeting, if it's required, is the 15th of December, which is next week. Agenda item 6 is any business the Chairman regards as urgent. And we have some urgent updates. I will remind you of those as we go through the agenda items, but they all should have hopefully been read. Okay. Agenda item 7, disclosures by members and officers. Any? No? Okay. Oh, sorry, Councillor English. I didn't see your hand go up. Apologies. Yes.
As I am a substitute member, and there are also other members here of P&R who are members and substitute members, for the record I will state that there have been discussions in relation to the sorting office purchase at P&R, but these have in no way influenced, in my view, any member's view on the planning application. So if, by some remote chance, I'm still here when we get to discuss that, I will be speaking and voting.
Thank you, Councillor English. It was fully noted and understood. Agenda 8, which is disclosure of lobbying. I will ask this as I go around on each agenda item. I've got a note on my agenda here to remind myself as much as anything else. I tend to forget. But we'll do that as we go to each agenda item. Agenda 9, which is whether we should take any items in private because of possible disclosure exempt information. There are none, there are no yellow pages, so that doesn't apply for this, I think. Agenda item 10, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of December. I wasn't present, so Councillor English, I might defer to you on this one. Do you want to?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I believe they are an accurate record.
Good. Everybody agrees with that, I sense. Good. Thank you. Agenda 11, presentation of petitions, if any. No? Okay. Agenda item 12, which is a reference from Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transportation Committee, the West Street, Harwich, Kent. Do you want to take that? Number 12. Before you do it. Councillor English.
Yes, as the original reference to strategic planning was due to me, I suppose it falls to me to speak to this item.
You may indeed.
The reason it was originally moved to that committee was under the Council's revised constitution, Strategic Planning Committee has the responsibility within the Council for residual transport issues that are not dealt with by the county highways, including traffic regulation orders. The Strategic Planning Committee has made the decision in relation to this reference and all future similar references that it is content for Planning Committee to directly deal with this issue in liaison with the Joint Transport Board and Kent County Council, and they do not require us to go through them. That is a very useful procedure, but clearly we couldn't just assume that, and that is now on the record. It's their decision, so we can now go forward with that, and I would anticipate that the relevant ward members will, and myself and officers will draw up something for the next committee cycle. It was too short notice for this one.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Councillor English. That's extremely helpful. I don't think we need to spend any more time on this. Okay. Agenda item 13, which are deferred items. And James?
Unfortunately, Chair, I've got nothing further to update on these two. I know I've updated on the first item numerous of times, but I haven't got anything at the current time to say to members when it is coming back to committee. We've had a word with the officer, and we are going to make sure it comes back at the earliest available opportunity.
Thank you for that. I have no problems with that, so I think we can move on. I have to say the first one is a bit Groundhog Day. I think it's been around some time, hasn't it? So we do need to resolve it at some point in time.
Yes, Chair. I get you.
No, it's all right. That wasn't right. Okay. Now we have changed the running order slightly. So the first item that we're going to take, and I think we've done this partly because I know the level of interest in this one, is agenda item 15. Which is reference 16//503-641, which is land to the east of Hermitage Lane, Mason, Kent. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Fortunately, we've got a few technical problems tonight, so unfortunately the television that was there for members of the public to review doesn't seem to be working, so the only one we have is the one behind me. So apologies for that. We can't resolve that matter at the current time. Can I just draw members' attention, first of all, to the urgent update papers? There's two, both the seen and the unseen urgent update papers before you. In essence, they deal with some additional plans that have been received in terms of following comments received from Councillor Harwood, from our landscape officer, and also for the KCC ecology officer. I'll go into the next detail in terms of concerns raised by residents about the number of plans being updated as we've moved forward towards this evening meeting. It also sets out the latest comments from KCC Ecology. Now, obviously, the applicants, as most of you will be aware, aren't required to submit the LEMP provisions, and where I refer to LEMP is the Landscape Ecological Management Plan. That was secured in the outline Section 106 agreement, so it's not tied to the outline permission. It's not required to be approved as part of the Reserve Matters application. But what I've tried to do is get the applicant to deal with the LEMP at the early stages, so members could actually view that LEMP provision tonight. KCC Ecology, after about 4 additions to that, have now satisfied with the LEMP details, both the strategic LEMP and the Phase 1 LEMP provision, and the Council's Landscape Officer and Horticultural Officer is also satisfied with those LEMP provisions. As I say, it's not a matter that needs to be agreed by members tonight, but there is that understanding that the LEMP details are now satisfied in terms of, at least from the officer point of view, they're required to be discharged through the Section 106, which is not a requirement for an input from members on the discharge of the 106 element. So that principally deals with the update on the LEMP provisions and KCC ecology comments. I would also add concern has been raised by a number of residents due to the limited period of consultation that was given. I will add, and my response on that is set out on the SEEN urgent update report, and that was posted on the website. A 7-day consultation was given. This application has been in for about a 6-month period of time. During that time, the scheme has been amended approximately about 75% when it was first consulted on the amendments on the 28th of September, where the full-time period for consultation was given. Since that time, there have been some minor additions. Now, obviously, the difficulty with an application like this is it has approximately 150, 180 plans with it. You amend one plan, you amend the subsequent approximately about 60 to 80 plans because they all relate to each other. So the reasons why there have been such a large number of amendments to the scheme, and hopefully members would appreciate, you'd expect officers to negotiate on these schemes when additions and stat consultees and neighbours are still responding on that right up to the time of the committee. So that's what's been occurring, as has happened with the LEMP provisions. I don't think I'll go into any more detail because it is set out on the LEMP provision and there's quite a lengthy report to go through. So, just going back to the background history of the application, if I could draw you to page 42 of the report, committee report, that does set out the background to the application. I don't propose to rehearse it in its entirety, but what I will say is the Secretary of State granted outline planning permission for the site in October 2015. I have attached in Appendix A and B both the Secretary of State's decision letter and also the conditions that he attached to that outline permission. So the principle for residential development for up to 500 dwellings, land safeguarded for an educational facility and community facility, provision of open space, associated infrastructure and the necessary demolition and earthworks, together with the formation of 2 access roads both from Hermitage Lane and Howard Drive, the Howard Drive being the bus-only access and pedestrian access, so that's not for vehicular access as opposed, apart from buses. So those are not a matter for consideration tonight. So they're not something that members can take into consideration tonight. The Secretary of State has approved those, and at the same time, when he approved those details, he approved the access road from Hermitage Lane into the site by 581 metres, so that's almost approximately in line with the reservoir, and from Howard Drive, approximately 67 metres into the site from Howard Drive. So those details are not for consideration for members tonight. All members will be considering are the details pursuant to that outline permission, which are layout, scale, appearance and landscaping. And as I've said to you earlier, the LEMP was not a requirement of either those 2 outline reserve matters for Phase 1. It is a Section 106 requirement, but that actually has now been satisfied before you tonight. So, hopefully I've dealt with those matters. Turning to the application itself, so in effect we have the application which was granted outline consent, which is the white area around here. We're talking about Phase 1, which is the red area here. This area is the reservoir. It's not within the applicant's ownership and is not for consideration. And this is the access point that has already been approved together with this white area. That was approved by the Secretary of State, and likewise from Howard Drive, that was also approved by the Secretary of State and is not for consideration. You have Barming Station over here. You have Hermitage Quarry access just off the point here, and you have the Little Hermitage down here. You've got an area of ancient woodland in this area, and what I sort of colloquially refer to as the hospital field here, which lies to the north of Maidstone Hospital, and then you've got the remaining areas around the site. So all members are considering, and also you've got the borough boundary here, which is worth pointing out that actually this area is for consideration by Tunbridge and Malling. So, but that only really relates to landscaping, but it's part and parcel of what Maidstone Borough Council officers have negotiated. And then you've got the Maidstone area here. So this area from here is what members are considering. So moving to photographs of the site. So the Hermitage Lane, this is the proposed access point. You've got Gallagher's quarry access just off to the right here. So this is the access, the approximate position of the access point. You can just see Bluebell Woods. It's what it's known as, which is includes the ancient woodland and secondary woodland over in this area here. Looking into the site, that grassed area is not part of the application. So the access takes approximate position, I'm not saying it in that exact position, approximate position across the field here, and then goes into the current orchard here, and then comes out into the area over here. So this is a slightly closer view, so the access goes through the orchard over here, and again, all these matters have already been secured and they're not part of consideration for tonight by members. Again, this just shows you a Bluebell Wood in the background, a slightly closer view of the woodland. These, turning around now to Howard Drive, these are the dwellings that are proposed to be demolished. Again, not part of current consideration, but they are the bus-only access and the pedestrian access from Howard Drive, and it would necessitate the demolition of these houses. Some concern has been raised by residents regarding the presence of bats. There has been a bat emergence survey that is included within the Phase 1 LEMP that has been assessed by KCC Ecology, and they're satisfied that there is no presence of bats within these buildings. So now I'm just going to take you for a very quick tour around the site. I'm sure most of the members know about the site particularly well. You've got the PROW running just off to the left up here, so I've just come off behind me. You've got Howard Drive. I've just come off the PROW into the field, which is what I call the reservoir field, and this is looking up that boundary and then looking towards the woodlands, the Bluebell Woods over here. And the next photographs will just look panoramic across the site. So again, this is moving across the site with the woodlands creating the high point, and that was one of the key features for its designation in the adopted 2000 local plan under H112, which saw these as key landscape features. So moving around again, moving around the site, the access road would be in that approximately that position here. The earthworks you can see here are Wessex Archaeology, who are currently carrying out their archaeological investigations, which are due to be concluded later on this week, I'm led to believe. And then you've got the byway just running up here. And then as you go around here, you've got the boundary. This is the boundary with the Howard Drive properties that back onto this area just off shot here. This is taken from the byway looking up towards the woodland. Again, you can just see this area where the Wessex Archaeology are carrying out their archaeological fieldworks. The previous photographs, I was just over there, looking up that way to the woodlands. This is on the opposite, this is on the byway. Again, looking up to the woodland, and you can see the reservoir just here. So this is the access that's been created off the byway. I've just walked further up the byway, which runs up here. And then you're looking towards, in effect, where, in an approximate position where the new access road would go into the site. So you've got the reservoir on the left-hand side, and the new road, which would run through a boulevard avenue of trees with the reservoir to the left-hand side. You've got secondary woodland area around here, which also comprises TPO areas. You've got the polygon ancient woodland within this area here, but effectively this is what's colloquially known as Bluebell Wood. Slightly closer view of the site shows you where they're doing the archaeology work. And again, this is literally turning 180 degrees back to where the access would be coming up. So the access would come up through here, through this orchard. Some of the orchard would be retained as public open space, but obviously some would be lost as creating part of the new access road. Moving on to the plans, we have the we have the phasing plan. As part of the outline permission, the applicants were required to submit a phasing plan. It's been part of quite a considerable part of the debate because this needs to be approved when the first reserve matters comes in. And in effect, what has been agreed is that the phase one land is this area here. It also includes, and has resulted in part of the negotiation, the buffer area of the ancient woodland, which effectively goes around from this area here. And it also extends further into this area, phase 3, the principle being that it's good practice to get the buffer areas planted up and established before you get residential usage of the site, and also before you go into sort of the phase 2 and 3. So the principle was trying to get the buffer area established early, and that's what's also informed the phase 1 LEMP provisions. So this is the access road. You've got a central spine road, primary route coming here and then going through to here. And again, as part of the outline condition, there is required to be a bus gate in this area to prevent other vehicular access. That's not for consideration tonight. It's part of an outline condition. It will need to be submitted and agreed by the local authority, but it's not for consideration tonight. Illustrative master plan. This just shows the concept of the site. I know quite a lot of concern might be raised about this point in terms of the access through the ancient woodland. A lot of you will know the Secretary of State's decision letter. This is not for consideration tonight. The only point of consideration is the phase 1 area, which includes this area here. So this just shows the concept of how the developers envisage the site coming forward. So moving on to the land use plan, as part of the outline consent, the Secretary of State / the inspector conditioned the amount of and type of open space to be allocated on the site. And effectively what this plan seeks to assure is that the phase 1 plan is on target to meet that level of open space. It sets out the requirement from the outline consent, and this shows that that element is being delivered as part of this scheme. Just point out also, as part of the negotiations, we've secured the addition of the open space area in this area as part of phase 1. That's so it can be established, it can be used, and it sort of creates a sense of place as soon as you start developing the site within phase 1. You've got the school site, again, the borough boundary between us and Tunbridge and Morling. This would eventually be the school, the community building, and other areas. The green areas are either a mixture of open space and semi-natural open space. And a lot of the semi-natural open space, these dark green areas, include either TPOs or woodland areas or ancient woodland. So that sets the context and it gives the assurance that the Reserve Matters Phase 1 is meeting its obligations from the outline application. Turning to the scheme itself, we're only considering layout, scale, appearance and landscaping. So the access road was already approved up to this point, and likewise was also approved up to this point by the Secretary of State. That sets the frame groundwork. It sets the primary route into the site, and then you have a number of secondary roads coming off that. The key issue with the scheme was to create or treat the woodland as a key landscape feature, not as a backdrop, but as a key landscape feature which should inform development of the site. So what you've got is a boulevard avenue coming down here lined with trees as the primary route. You've got some key vista buildings here which try to frame the woodland view. You've got areas that open up into the woodland through here. You've got very strong defined boundaries to define your primary route, so that enables people in terms of wayfinding to find their way around the site. So it establishes a clear hierarchy of buildings to show the predominant streets within the site. They then cascade towards lower storey buildings to give towards the more edges of the site, especially as you come to here to a more rural woodland setting. But so the key elements that you'll set out in the report are some vista buildings and some framing buildings, so it helps you establish key routes. To also note within the site, this line marks the polygon ancient woodland. You have the minimum 15-metre buffer areas which are included in the Phase 1 area, and the report also sets out that you've got additional land over and above that which varies between 2 metres and in areas 31 metres before you get to the access road. You then get the dwellings set back off this which front onto the woodland, and therefore there has been previous concern about how you treat the woodland and how you develop it to prevent domestic animals from entering into the woodland. And by this arrangement, you don't get gardens backing onto the woodland, so you won't get an encroachment and loss of the woodland. So also within the Phase 1 LEMP, you've got quite detailed landscaping, which Councillor Harwood has, as you'll set out in the urgent updates, has had an input in terms of the latest landscaping details, which are to prevent access into the buffer areas. That will also be fenced and lined with a 1.2 metre high picket fence in this area, again to prevent encroachment within this area. The LEMP provisions also set out the details for management of the ancient woodland, which are now brought forward to Phase 2 instead of Phase 4, and they will come through in the later phases. There has been concern raised about the area, this area here. Previously, the outline scheme looked at a LEAP, which is a local area of action, a local action area play in approximately this area here. Following pre-application discussions, that wasn't considered appropriate for this site given its key landscape feature. So, following quite detailed discussions, we've opted for a phased approach to children's play areas, a more holistic approach to play, which tries to take pressure off the ancient woodland, tries to locate play areas outside that, so it encourages children and other people to play on essentially timber framework play equipment, not the standard play equipment they usually get. There are details set out within the application on what type of play equipment is envisaged. It's all set out on the website. I haven't got the details on the presentation. I think it's long enough for members, but it sets out quite a detailed element of why the council has gone down this approach, or why your officers have gone down this approach. And the key area is to take pressure off the ancient woodland to almost prevent play within the woodland, so you've got an area to play outside of it, and it's more befitting to the setting. I know there has been concern raised by archaeology. Just to address that point in principle, there is also a conditions application which is currently being considered. Wendy Rogers, who's the KCC archaeology officer, has approved the access road a discharge, and purely only for the access road, because she's asked for further work to be carried out principally in this area around here, because it may have archaeological importance. And what we're proposing to do is the outline archaeology condition would only be discharged for the access road only, so it will only allow this area to be constructed. The applicants will have to come back with another sub-application, a condition application to discharge the remaining parts, and we'd consider that on its merits as and when it came in. So they wouldn't be able to commence works in this particular area until that has been discharged, and that's been agreed with Wendy Rogers. I must move on rapidly. Storey heights, page 49 of your report sets out a sort of a clear logical hierarchy, with the blue areas, the dark blue areas showing the three-storey elements to give a clear hierarchical street. This is the key importance on Phase 1, so it gives you a key wayfinding area into the site. You then drop that down to principally 2 stories as you go around to the edges, but again, as I said, these are vista features, buildings that are meant to frame the woodland, and also you can see those as you look down the access road, and that frames the woodland vista. So there is a sort of a clear logic in terms of the 3-storey buildings, and that follows then to another clear logic of 2 stories as you move across the site. Housing mix. In terms of the housing mix, this shows the distribution across the site. It varies from 1-bed flats 2 5-bed houses. I won't go into all the detail. In essence, you've got 4-bed units here in the light blue. You've got various number in terms of 1-bed units here. What the plan shows, there is a good mix across the site as required by adopted policy and the NPPF. Housing tenure. In terms of, again, you've got housing tenure ranging from 1-bed flats to 4-bed houses. In terms of affordable housing, you've got 55 dwellings being delivered on the Phase 1. The whole outline scheme required 30% across the whole site. The Section 106 requires that to be delivered 30% in each phase. So again, we get a pepper potting of affordable housing around the site, and this shows where the various buildings are to be located within the development. We've got a parking strategy plan. Again, I refer to page numbers. All the details are set out in the committee report in terms of what the parking provision is on site, but all units either have allocated or unallocated. I'll just draw members' attention as part of the strategy and negotiation on the site. It was to increase parking on the public highway, obviously because there could, hopefully there will be enjoyment of the woodland in future years. So quite a lot of work has been done to increase parking provision within the highway, and you'll see that by the light-coloured areas in this area here. Turning to the materials plan, very briefly, the blue colour is a natural slate. The orange colour is a plain tile. You've got a various mix, and just in these buildings here, the centre square buildings, they are ragstone buildings in this area. You've got Hermitage Quarry just at the end, so it gives a very clear identity to the scheme. When you come up the road, you see the big ragstone buildings, and I'll show you a picture of that later. And there's also yellow stock brick in there. Again, you've got a clear hierarchy of the other buildings having yellow stock brick, and as you move over to the other side, you've got reg stock brick, and certain areas have, certain buildings have render on them. So in terms of, there's a clear logic and sense of place created by the materials used on plan form. Matters relating to renewable energies are a requirement of the outline condition. They haven't been discharged. They will be at a later date. Lighting plan was also a requirement. Obviously, the sensitivities of the woodland. The applicants have had to submit details of a lighting plan, which your officers are satisfied with. Likewise, hard surface materials. It shows where key areas are. You've got car parking areas which are hidden generally from public view. You've got these raised table areas with high-quality materials, creating sort of junction and square areas as you move around the site. So again, just back to the site layout, I'm going to take you back to this building here. It's just one example of a building. Now this is one of the key buildings on the site. Hasn't come out quite so clearly, but in effect this building will be ragstone faced on the ground floor. These key areas here will be ragstone faced with yellow stock brick, and it's got nuances or linkages to the previous hospital building. So as you come down the principal road into the site, you'll see this quite grand building with its Victorian Edwardian balconies. Again, this shows the rear of the site, so it doesn't just stop at the front. You've got ragstone features as you're peering up through the building on these gable ends. Just very quickly through the street scene, I haven't included, you'll be glad to hear, loads of house types. There are lots of them. All the house types do turn the buildings, but this just gives you a sense of scale. So looking at this corner from the entrance road, looking down here, so this is the building that curves the way around the corner and then carries on, so it has a clear scale and hierarchy as you move down the main street. Street scene 2, in terms of, this is at the area here, so it's towards the edge of the site and has a much different character, all principally 2-storey. Street scene 3 is the area around the woodland here, so you've got this 3-storey element here, which starts up here, cascades down. It's again more domestic in character, 2-storey, fronts onto the woodland. And then you've got these key vista buildings here, which then go up to 3-storey in this location here, to promote and to frame that vista, and it allows a clear view coming through down the principal route as you go through here. Moving on to street scene 4, effectively this is a section running down the main high street. So in terms of where you've got running from these buildings at the front, running down the side, this is the main access road, the key Ragstone buildings on here as you enter into the square, and then you carry on down these buildings, which again 3-storey and have a strong frontage. Street scene 5 on the opposite side of the road. In terms of, again, you can see these very strong Ragstone building here. And again, this is the ancient woodland here, and it steps down and then carries on as you go down that main principal street. Then we get to the outer edges of phase 1, street scene 6, and then street scene 7. So in effect, street scene 6 there, street scene 7 gives you a perception of how the street is. So working on street scene 7 here, so that is that building there. You've got the primary road running here, so it's 3-storey in height, which carries the continuancy of the street, and then it drops down to 2 stories as you go down to secondary streets. And then likewise going on the other way, starting in this point here, you've got a 3-storey building that turns the corner and then drops down in scale as you get down to this corner here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. There are lots of plans submitted with the application. The arboricultural method statement has been looked at in detail. Likewise, so has the landscaping detail by both the KCC ecology officer, the landscape officer. They are all considered acceptable. The arboricultural method statement sets out the principles of how the sites and those existing trees, those trees which will be taken out, and how those trees that are remained will be protected. I can't show it in here, but it all sets out in very clear detail that all the protection and preventative measures will be in place prior to commencement of development on site. So in terms of protection of those areas that are those trees and those buffer areas that's going to be retained, they will be protected, and there are numerous plans on the website that set out how they are going to be achieved. I think that's the end of my presentation, Chair. I think the principal issue I would just ask members to consider again is purely this is an application only for details of matters relating to layout, scale, appearance and landscaping. It is not consideration for access. It is only those matters, and it is a details pursuant to the outline consent. You have the conditions that were imposed on the outline consent and the Secretary of State's letter. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, James. That's a very clear presentation, if I may say so. Thank you very much. Before we go any further, I haven't asked whether you've all been lobbied or not, as the case may be. Can I think it's everybody. I can certainly put my hand up to that. Okay. I think everybody, so that's noted. Okay. Now, before I invite speakers, I would just like to invite my legal advisor to just set out the rules for speaking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a short announcement for members of the public, and in particular those who are speaking on any item this evening. As you've just heard, the item is announced by the Chairman, and then the Planning Officer will introduce the item. The Chairman will then call on the various speakers to come forward and talk. When you hear your name called, please could you come forward to the table in front of you and take a seat. To speak, press the middle button. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green, and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. You will have 3 minutes to speak. And I would like to say you'd see your time counting down on the screen behind me, but we're adopting the mobile phone method this evening. A noise will emanate from the phone, which will tell you that your time is up. Once you've finished speaking, please press the middle button again. It'll turn white and then return to your seat. Now, you would have heard that there are visiting members. They are members of the Council, but they do not sit on this committee. They also have 3 minutes to speak, but they have no right to vote on any of the applications. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Russell, for that. Right, I would like to invite Mrs. Bates, who I think is an objector.
It is obvious from comments written in the submission that Allington is not seen as a semi-rural area, but it is. Quotes such as "this strong urban form" or "the general conformity with the landscape guidelines to the Maidstone character" lead one to think otherwise. If this layout is suitable for an urban setting, put it in an urban environment, not in Allington. Until just a few weeks ago, crops were growing in this field. Anyone who has visited or seen photos of the area would not call it urban by any stretch of the imagination. You have chosen to ignore, nor do you appreciate, the semi-rural character of Allington, with its open aspect and chiefly single-storey dwellings. You have decided to cram as many ugly little boxes as possible into the space available. The designs of both the layout and individual dwellings are unimaginative and uninspiring. The 3-storey blocks aligning the access route are totally out of scale at over 35 feet, nearly 36 feet high, more than twice the height of my bungalow, and will obscure entirely any views of the ancient woodland. The remaining areas are far too densely packed, giving this bleak, desultory estate an ambience reminiscent of a 60s tower block. I had hoped for a development of which we could be proud, a prestige estate that would have enhanced the area rather than this mediocre offering with no style and no redeeming features. I can see no reference to the mitigation of creosote, which we know exists on the site. What will be done to reduce the carcinogenic effects of it to protect future generations? It is important to deal with it before construction commences. I note 55 of the dwellings are supposed to be affordable. Are they to be offered to the homeless of Maidstone, or will they be bought by some London borough? All the estates currently under construction around Allington and Barming are similar, soulless and indistinguishable from one another. We deserve better than this. I think these plans need to be reconsidered, or once again the people of Allington will have been let down by self-interested developers and poor planning decisions.
Thank you, Mrs. Bates. A call on Mrs. Poletti.
The original outline plan for this development featured a traditional play area situated within the interior of the site, which is now phase 1 of the proposed 500 new homes. In the reserve matters we see before us today, this play area has now been removed and resited to a new woodland play scheme and activity centre. In fact, over 70% of the outline plan has now been changed, and no current environmental impact statement provided. This new play area is situated extremely close to the ancient woodland and its protected buffer zone, and equally close to the heritage area requiring evaluation. There will be a large range of climbing frames, slides, swings, woodland walkways, and additional planting, whilst many of the tree protection orders are being ignored. This decision will have a disastrous effect on the ecology, woodland wildlife, and particularly breeding birds. The bluebell wood we know today will no longer exist. I would like to ask the Council if any risk assessment has taken place in deciding to allow this children's play area within the woodland. It seems to me that the applicant and officers are not aware of some very important local facts. For the past 15 years, I have been the Neighbourhood Watch coordinator for Allington, and I can confirm to you that within the last 7 weeks, there have been 6 police reports of serious and ongoing indecent behaviour in this wood. In addition, there are reports of drug taking in the immediate area, and you will find evidence such as this, cannabis bags. And last but not least, the woodland is only a few metres away from Barming High Security Psychiatric Hospital, whose patients frequently use the woodland, sometimes illegally having escaped. Is this really the safest place for children to play? All of you here, please examine your thoughts on this. Most of you here this evening are probably parents or grandparents, and I hope you will share my concern for this ill-thought-out change of plan and defer this application. This is a well-documented site of special archaeological importance, containing the remains of the St. Lawrence's Chapel, Roman settlements and burial grounds. The entire site should be subject to evaluation before Phase 1 is allowed to commence. The ancient woodlands should remain public open space and nature reserve, and not a playground that potentially puts children at risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Paletti. That was spot on time-wise. Mr. Brown for the applicant, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Paul Brown, and I'm the architect working for Crowdays Homes, responsible for the detailed design of the master plan, and in particular the Phase 1 layout and dwelling types that I set before you tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of this application, which is for the approval of the details of the appearance, landscaping, layout and scale of this Phase 1 Reserve Matters application. It is the first application required to discharge planning condition number 2 of the outline consent for 500 dwellings dated 19th of October 2015. It was in December of last year that Crowdays began the pre-application advice request with Maidstone Borough Council. We attended 2 meetings with members of the planning team and tabled layout plans, street scenes, house types and a design and access statement describing the design approach to be taken. In April we submitted the Reserve Matters application for Phase 1 and comments from the consultees were forthcoming in July. In particular, comments on urban design were received from the Design South East panel. These were addressed in the latest plans. During August, we attended an interim planning meeting to review the latest proposals. The urban design comments were extensive, resulting in the redesign of 70% of the layout, including new house and apartment types, in order to meet the aspirations of the panel. In September, the Phase 3 public open space was added into Phase 1 to ensure its early establishment. House numbers dropped from 186 to 183 due to layout changes. Throughout November, we've been in close contact with the case officer, responding to ongoing comments and requests from the consultees. The ancient woodland buffer was included within Phase 1. The site-wide landscape and ecological management plan was revised along with the detailed planting plans. An additional detailed Phase 1 LIMP was also provided. Further revisions to the site layout were made, including replanning one street and extending a block of apartments to further improve the urban design quality. This December, we've continued to respond to further ecological comments, made changes to the planting specifications requested by one of the councillors, and updated the detailed landscape and ecological management plan to include comprehensive timetables for the works as requested. Crowdays Homes are committed to continuing working with the council to achieve the objective of producing a high-quality, well-designed new community that provides much-needed housing within the borough. We look forward to working with all the members of the council throughout each phase of the development to ensure that the quality of the housing, design and the landscaping remain at a consistently high level throughout. I therefore respectfully request that members accept the officer's recommendation and resolve to grant the Reserve Matters approval for this phase of the development. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. I'd like to call on Councillor Mrs. Robertson.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members. The loss of this undeveloped land on the very edge of Allington will be keenly felt by both our residents and the wildlife. We've lived with the threat of development for many years, but the die was cast when the planning inspector overruled the decision of this council by allowing the appeal last year. We now have to look forward and ensure that the valuable natural features and characteristics of this site are protected for the enjoyment of the existing and future residents of Allington whilst it is being developed. Mr Bailey, the case officer, has worked hard with the developers to secure substantial amendments to the initial plans for the first phase. In particular, the buffer area to the ancient woodland will be included so it has a chance to establish itself from the outset. Policy H12 refers to the access onto Hermitage Lane to be made in the vicinity of the land opposite the entrance to Hermitage Quarry. The current plans show the access to be south of the quarry entrance, and I should particularly like to hear from the highway officer present this evening whether he considers this to be safe in highway terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Robinson. Councillor Lewis, please.
Good evening, all. As you're aware, this is a contentious and unwanted application affecting many residents and commuters alike. However, I do have faith in yourselves and the officers and the planning committee to view this application sensitively. I would like the Hermit's Chapel and the archaeological artefacts to be noted and put forward as part of the Maidstone's heritage. That's all I need to say. Thank you for your time.
Councillor Willis, please. Please, yes.
I'd like to start by being positive. An awful lot of community campaigning and work by the resident group has gone on, and I think I have to congratulate the residents on the work they've done in lobbying officer and improving the scheme, and the work that he's done to actually make it better. But I have to go back to the background of why we are here. This is a scheme that was put forward to us a year and a half ago, so 2 years ago, and was rejected by the committee, widely rejected. The government have overruled that. The planning inspector by the government have overruled that, and we are now, as we said at the beginning, we're trying to make good of a scheme that we didn't choose in the first place. So please, planning committee tonight, take as long as you can, and please be as scrutineering as you can into this, particularly looking at the effects on the wildlife, the suitability of the play park, which has been excellently designed, but suitability and make sure we protect the heritage that may or may not be laid close to that. The other last thing is not for your decision tonight, but painting the background. You're going to have phases 2 and 4 of this coming to you. Phases 2 includes how we manage the woodland. I think, correct with the officer, but phases 2 decides how we manage the woodland moving forward. So that's in the background to this. And phase 4 has the road which goes through the wood, which was the main reason it was rejected in the first place, sadly overruled by the government. The last thing is, I think, the traffic issue. You're talking about the detail of this plan, but just remember in the background when these other things come forward to you, and please, we would like to hear from Kent County Council, and I'll ask you guys, you need to ask. Hermitage Lane started in 2005, correct me if I'm wrong, Hermitage Lane had one set of traffic lights. It was a lane. Now it's a bit more like the Las Vegas. In 2020, it'd be more like the Las Vegas Strip. 5 sets of traffic lights that may or may not be talking to each other. And I don't know if you guys know of the Audi incident in Tunbridge and Morley on the A20 junction. And lots of junctions. This site has a most inappropriate junction. The good news is, I think working together, from tonight, we can work to try and improve that. But mostly, you can't rule on that tonight as far as I'm aware, but please scrutinise it as much as you can. Heritage, there's a very old chapel, that's a 1200 chapel that's in that area which needs to do more work on before it comes back. the protection of the wooded area and consideration of future schemes and consideration moving forward of the traffic issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Willis. Before I give the floor, I just want to reinforce the point that it is about layout, scale, appearance and landscaping. That is the issue we're discussing tonight, and I think we must keep our minds on that. I know it's tempting to move away, but we mustn't, all right? So that's and there is a clear recommendation on page 54, which I think I'm sure you've all seen, so it's a very clear recommendation. So I just want to highlight this because I think this is where we've got to concentrate on. But I've got a number of speakers. Councillor Bolton first, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I think we've got to, as was made very clear in a very good presentation by the officer, appreciate what we're deciding tonight and what we're not deciding tonight. And no one has, well, everyone knows my views on what's happened on Hermitage Lane over the past few years and whose responsibility that is. And this council has got to bear a lot of responsibility for the problems that's facing that lane at the moment and are going to come in the future. But you're quite right. We are here to discuss the details of this application, and the Secretary of State made, the Planning Inspectorate made very clear their views. And this is to an extent we have to work with what we've got and make the best of a situation that I'm sure not many of us would like to be in. Me certainly not. So bearing that in mind. And looking specifically at Phase 1 and specifically at the issues which we can decide tonight, I'm left with one overriding question, really, and that is the impact of the three-storey buildings, because to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are very few three-storey buildings in the vicinity of this particular development, particularly on the Allington, the Howard Drive side, northeastern part of the application sites. And I just wonder whether the officer would be able to give some further information on the visual impact that the three-storey buildings proposed would have on those existing residents in that part of Allington, and also a bit of Heath Ward, which sort of near Maidstone Hospital, that type of area. So I'd be interested if the officers could perhaps expand more on that, because what we don't particularly want to create as we move further away from Maidstone Town Centre is to have taller buildings. I don't think that works, particularly as this is probably on higher land than existing developments as well. So that's my one point I'd make at this stage, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bolton. I'll ask, could you come straight back on that? It might be, then I'll go to Councillor English.
Yeah, taking you back to the original consent, the outline consent set a maximum height limit of 11 metres, which the inspector set and conditioned in the outline consent. You've also got to be wary that there is a school building here, and that's where, in terms of the 11-metre height set. So no building on the site can exceed the outline, the height limit imposed by the outline consent. In terms of principles and wayfinding, what you would normally try to do in terms of urban design is you try to centre your higher buildings along principal primary routes. So it gives a clear identity and hierarchy of the street that you're trying to create. Because what the importance of the Phase 1, because if you don't get Phase 1 right, how can you get Phase 2, 3 and 4 correct? So what you try to do in general terms is you try to centre your larger buildings generally towards the centre of the site along key arterial routes. So in terms of principles, and then what you do is you then cascade those down as you meet the edges of the site, either to blend in with existing development or else to to give you a logical route. So in terms of the heights, I feel, and obviously the design panel feel, that a three-storey element, which was the highest limit that was imposed, and there will be other buildings on the site, i.e. the school building, the community building, which will need to come forward, should be centred centrally along these primary routes, and then you cascade them out. So I and the design panel considered that three-storey is acceptable in design terms and creates a logical hierarchy and a route through the site.
Are you okay with that?
Can I just come back on a very quick point on that, Mr. Chairman? And I apologise for being somewhat pedantic, but considering the level of detail which we're being asked to consider tonight, I think it's actually quite important, as Councillor Willis said, to spend as much time as possible to go over the specifics of this application. And I'm looking at this site in the context of the existing development around it, the existing development that will come, whether we like it or not, as well. And so while I appreciate its importance to have the main spine road having primary buildings there, I accept that totally. What I don't want is that to stick out like a sore thumb throughout the roads leading off, or my original point being the existing developments in Allington itself and the existing development to come. And I don't know, Mr. Bailey, if you can go back to, I think it's that one there, but there was, that's what I'm really concerned about, because it does undulate slightly, the site in question. And so I'm looking at this from existing residents' point of view, not necessarily from people who be living in phase one. I'll leave it there.
You're quite right. The reasons why I've come back to this picture is because landform is an integral part. So you'll note that as you come across from Hermitage Lane, the land rises and you've got Bluebell Wood, which is the high point in the site. It then drops down to the lower point in the site. So in terms of where you're coming through as viewed from the surrounding area, you're coming up the road here and then you're going into the site. So in terms of what this is kind of creating an extension to the urban boundary, but you're not going to mimic Howard Drive's principally bungalow styles, because they're 70s and, you know, I have to be honest, they're not the most efficient use of land. So what you're trying to do, and the whole point of the scheme, is that you graduate the building form down as you meet the outer edges. So what it tries to do is it tries to link in and creates a softening impact to those neighbouring properties, because there aren't, I can't name a scheme that's built bungalows in the borough. And in terms of drawing particular reference, land west of Hermitage Lane has a number of higher buildings on the site. Now, I have to then take us back to the outline consent, which both the Inspector and the Secretary of State considered, that they considered that three-storey buildings were acceptable because they imposed a height limit of no building exceeding 11 metres. So in terms of principles, while he wasn't considering layout scale, he imposed a height limit of no more than 11 metres. So the issue of three-storey buildings, and that's, let's not forget, they're three-storey buildings with roof, of which they don't exceed 11 metres. So how that design is moved forward, that needs to come through as a key kind of urban element. And what we're trying to do is create a key street which is framed by 3 stories, and then it graduates down. So certainly, I personally think 3 stories is acceptable, but not only that, the Secretary of State accepted 11 metres in height when he granted the outline planning permission.
Councillor English, please.
Right. A number of things. I mean, none of us would like to be here. The council and officers and the community did not want this planning application to go ahead. However, the Secretary of State, in his infinite wisdom, decided it would. When dealing with an issue like this, there are a number of possible design approaches. We should not fall into the trap of assuming that the only possible design solution that's acceptable is to replicate either here or anywhere else what already exists. I have to say, purely from a subjective point of view, I happen to feel that actually some parts of Maidstone could do with some taller buildings than they have, and actually they look a little, that some parts of them look a little bit like New Romney and could actually do with some height. But even if that were not the case, the Secretary of State has been very clear that up to 11 metres is acceptable. So we cannot, as a committee, decide to substitute our judgment for the Secretary of State's judgment and say we think they're too high, because that's been ruled out. So any design argument would have to be on the merits or otherwise of the buildings themselves in terms of their material, their height, their design. And I think when we started off, and when Mr Bailey and his colleagues started off, actually, there were quite a lot of things wrong with the design, and one of the reasons there have been so many plans coming through is because a lot of work had to be done to make this somewhat better than simply acceptable. And the solution is, in my opinion, generally one that architecturally is appropriate. Turning to the play area, yeah, I have always been of the view that this council has had a very, very boring, straitjacketed approach, and it's the same leap everywhere in the borough of Maidstone, the only difference being whether it faces north, south, east or west, and what colour the climbing frame and has been painted. So I have actually long believed that woodland play equipment of this type is actually more interesting for children and their relatives, and we should have been doing this years ago rather than bog standard leaps. As far as I understand it, this is not an encroachment into the woodland, although it might look like it on the paper, but it's actually designed to give the woodland a bit more body and protection. Now, that's not to say we couldn't argue about the detail, but in principle, it seems to be an acceptable approach. And substituting a leap instead of it, and also, having shorter buildings with bungalows with bigger gardens and footprints actually means that the woodland buffer protection gets threatened, and we are actually likely to, if anything, lose that over time to the sort of situation that's happened elsewhere in Maidstone, where woodland and common land and amenity land has been enclosed and become part of people's gardens. And that would be unfortunate if, as a result of a different layout, we put this area under pressure. So I think in terms of what we are determining today, that this is an acceptable scheme. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there aren't still major problems with this site. I think going forward, we as officers and members have got to try to work with the developer. That's not always been easy, to actually look at this access again, because I don't think, although I know, Mr. Chairman, it's not covered by the application this evening, but I still think we need to put on record that we would be seeking to try, as a council, to move that on from that decision as we go forward. Similarly, yes, I know the only part of the archaeology we're considering this evening is the access road, and as far as I can see, that's acceptable and that's fine. But just to place on record, as the visiting members and community has, there may be quite a rich archaeological heritage in this site. So just to make it clear, I think that Kent Archaeology and this council and the officers are on top of that, but just for the record, we need to be as robust as possible to ensure that no action is taken that might, shall we say, imperil anything is on that site, so that we can't discover it, preserve it, whether that's in situ or vary phase 2, 3 or 4 going forward to preserve as much of the heritage of this area as possible. Now, we don't need to make any resolutions tonight, but we do need to make it clear going forward as a council and as officers that we hear what's being said when we do place importance on that. And as we go forward to the future phases, we will be seeking to address those issues at the appropriate time, both in the committee and, more importantly, in the negotiations that have been going on. And by the way, James, Mr. Bailey, sorry, congratulations on your negotiating techniques so far. You've been doing an excellent job in very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I totally agree with that comment. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. There's been a lot of references to the Secretary of State's decision in 2015 to the outline consent for 500 dwellings. I think actually the die was set a lot longer ago. In the Maidstone Borough-wide Local Plan 2000, Maidstone Borough Council sought to protect this piece of land and wider areas of land along Hermitage Lane to try and preserve the setting of northwest Maidstone. But the inspector for the Maidstone Borough-wide Local Plan 2000 actually imposed a housing development onto this site. And it was only the intervention by Mr. Prescott in 2002 with his moratorium on greenfield development, which gave the site a stay of execution. That the coalition government unfroze greenfield sites in 2010, and the site subsequently came forward in the evolving local plan. And I actually think that freezing of greenfield allocations has actually brought real benefits. If this site had been developed back in 2000, it would have been, I suggest, a very bog-standard housing estate round it. I think in the period up to 2016, I think we've learnt an awful lot of lessons as to how we enable good design and how we can safeguard ancient woodland and so on. I also think that the campaigning by local residents and their representatives has shone such a bright light on this site that we really have got, in many ways, in design terms, an exemplar scheme coming forward. And you may kind of balk at that, but then, you know, take a look at some developments going up in some other parts of Maidstone and compare with the plans that we've got, you know, here in front of us. In terms of the specific detail here, I think the ancient woodland, which was actually identified by the local plan inspector back in 2000, is absolutely pivotal. It marks the ridge of high land. It is the boldest landscape characteristic in this area, and it's got to be defended. It's a remarkable survival. It's still got pignut and yellow archangel and wood anemones and broad buckler fern, you know, real ancient woodland indicators that you just don't get in modern woodland and secondary woodland. We've had ancient woodland enclosed by housing estates in other places, like in Maidstone, like Vinters Park and Grove Green. Within a year or two of those estates being built, the ancient woodland was devastated. They were fly-tipped, full of garden cuttings, trampled, and try and find a bluebell or a primrose on any of the fragments of woodland at Vinters Park and Grove Green. You won't find any. However, in this case, placing the highway as a barrier between the housing and the wood, placing strong defensive and now prickly planting along the woodland edge really makes a difference. And there's evidence of that in some members of this committee's ward, for example, at Furfield Quarry, and where the Longshore was a similar fragment of ancient woodland. It was defensively planted. That development has now been in place for 7 or 8 years, and it has still got its bluebells. It has still got its ancient woodland planting in there. So it really can work if it's done properly. As a final point, I do applaud the work of Mr Bailey and his colleagues in terms of design, and I think within the parameters set by the Secretary of State, we've gone a long way. And I've actually also got to say that the applicant has actually worked very positively with Maidstone Borough Council at this stage. I think there were some issues earlier on, but I think at the design stage, with the architects, it's worked really well, and the landscape architects. I am a little bit concerned, though, that we've not got the details of the renewable energy generation and some of the issues around the integral niches for wildlife, the kind of bat bricks and the swift bricks and things. Because if they're bolted on at the end and they're not part of the original design, they can look just that bolted on, and often are actually just bolted on. We want them actually integral and built in, and I think, you know, I'd like to, you know, kind of just ask the officers to ensure that those sustainability elements are as just a part of the design as the bricks or the tiles are. But with that, I'm willing to move that we do grant permission as per the papers and all of the caveats in the urgent update. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Councillor Harwood, and Councillor English. Just before we go, I think condition 5 does cover points, some of the points you raised, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I quite agree with you, Councillor Harwood, in terms of certain details. The actual detail wasn't in there, hence the condition 5, page 55 of the report does try to pick that out. Not only that, other conditions seek to make sure we don't get those horrible, and I know the architect is here, we don't get those horrible meter boxes to the front of the dwellings. I can't stand them, and we won't have them on this scheme. Likewise with the Swift bricks and back boxes as well. I want to know where they are and when they're going up. So the condition 5 seeks to provide that detail.
Councillor Cox, would you like to speak?
I wonder if, Mr Chairman, we may ask, seeing as Kent County Council Highways are here, I realise this isn't going to make much of a difference to our decision this evening, but we have had questions from the public and also our visiting members. I wonder if we could be told about the circumstances that have given rise to that junction that leads from this development onto Hermitage Lane. I wonder if we could hear about the evidence that was gathered and the possible modelling and how that was looked at so that we might understand how it's correct. So I know it's not going to do anything, but we've heard lots of other detail, and I wonder if, seeing as you're here, whether we could hear how that was got at, how we came to that decision to have this junction with a traffic light and coming out of the quarry without. Thank you.
Councillor Cox, you've actually read my mind. I've written this down. It's a very, very good point. I would just like to hear from Ken Hart, as you're here.
Thank you, Chairman. I can give you what history I know, because this obviously stretches back several years, and my predecessors actually were the ones who were involved in the early negotiations with the developer. I mean, essentially, we have to review an access proposal that is put before us. And the developer came forward with a form of junction that was staggered from the quarry access, the separation distance between the two being around 50-60 metres. Now, a signalised arrangement was put forward on the basis that that was simply the safest means of enabling vehicles to turn into and out of the development. And that arrangement, when it was put forward as part of the planning application, went through all of the normal reviews, audits and checks that we do on any proposed junction onto the public highway network. Again, in keeping with the approach we normally apply, this access arrangement has been the subject of a road safety audit. That audit has not flagged up any safety-related issues, certainly none in association with the quarry access and the interaction between the two, given that they are staggered. And it's on that basis that it is technically an acceptable layout, and at no point has the Highway Authority had grounds to resist that proposal.
Thank you very much. Yes, we were staggered too.
Yeah. Do you want to get... It might be better if you do it rather than me.
Sorry, Councillor Harwood. Could I just get clarification? You've moved the application on the papers with the urgent updates?
And with that change to the Swift bricks and back boxes,
Sorry, if I may just... I think Councillor Harwood's issue with regards to the back bricks, is that condition 5? I think, does that cover it?
Yeah, I think my concern is that we have no details currently. It's a matter that we're seeking the further clarification and detail on. What I wanted to ensure was that the renewable energy generation and those niches for wildlife, that they're integral to the design and not a later bolt-on. So I think it's more of emphasis and something that perhaps the case officer can take away and ensure that this does happen? Because I understand this is a planning device to deliver the details so that they can be signed off. I think this is a bigger philosophical issue about the overall design, incorporating those elements integrally.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Harwood. I think 5A does pretty well cover it, actually, when I look at it, but this will be followed up anyway, so no problem. We have a proposer, we have a seconder, and I'm going to put this to the committee now. Are we in favour of the recommendation that's on paragraph 11 of the report? Does seem.
Against?
And against, please.
Against? No?
No? Abstention?
Abstentions. 1, 2, 3.
3. Okay. Well, thank you, members. I think we've covered that item.
The application is approved.
Yes, the application is approved. Good. Okay. Right. We turn now to it's agenda item 16, which is page 64 of the report, and it's item 16/506-630, which is St Faith's Bungalow, St Faith's Lane, Bearsted.
Mr. Chairman,
Kent.
could you give me a minute or two whilst people
Yeah, sure.
talk possible,
Yeah,
because
no
it's
problem.
going to be a bit disruptive otherwise.
Don't worry.
If you return before it starts.
You better run. I won't start the meeting. I'll hold the meeting, all right? Yeah.
To say we're having a short break.
We're having a very short break just to allow people to adjust. I'm going to call to order. Councillor Bolton, is that?
Yeah, they're all bungalows.
Is that Councillor Bolton? Okay, you're in the room, so.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Please order, please. We're going to make a start now. So it's reference 16/506-630. And who is presenting? Go for it.
Thank you, Chair. This application is for St Faith's Bungalow in St Faith's Lane, Bearsted. This first image shows the situation on site as it stands at the moment, showing the existing bungalow. We have St Faith's Lane on the left-hand side of the site location plan, Yeoman's Lane on the right-hand side. There's a fall in ground level towards the rear of the site, and 10 and 11 St Faith's Court at the bottom of the image. The present building is a bungalow, but you can see that it has a sort of fairly high roof. This is the front elevation of the actual bungalow from St Faith's Lane. Further image of the front of the building with the buildings at the rear visible on the sort of left-hand side there. This is an image from the St Faith's Lane, looking back towards the site, with the application site on the right-hand side. You have 2- and 3-storey buildings in Bearsted views in the background. This image is from the back garden of the existing bungalow, showing St Faith's Court in the background, with the sort of change in level visible there. In terms of the proposal, this is for 2 detached buildings. There's a sort of notional gap between them. The early application on the site was refused planning permission because of the impact on 10 and 11 St Faith's Court at the back of the site. This was in terms of loss of privacy and overbearing impact. The applicant has sought to take on board those early concerns, and the buildings have been moved further away, so you get the over the sort of normal separation distance of 20 metres. The roof form has been changed from a gable to a hipped roof. The height of the proposed building is lower than an earlier permission. That can be seen on this image with the red line showing that earlier height. The building is laid out over three levels. At lower ground floor, which is orientated to the rear, you have living areas. At ground floor, you have parking spaces accessed from the front, with dining and kitchen areas, and on the upper floor, the bedrooms. The officers consider that this scheme has actually addressed the earlier grounds for the refusal of permission, and the officer's recommendation is to approve subject to planning conditions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Before we go any further, can I ask if anybody's been lobbied on this? Yes, I think that's unanimous, I think. Everybody. Thank you very much for that. Right. I'd like to call on the first speaker, Mr. Clifford, for the objectors, please. I'm afraid that's not part of the presentation, so we can't put it up. Okay. Has everybody got it in their, if they've got it in their packs, then we're okay. Okay. 64 of the report. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Chairman and members, my name is Brian Clifford. I live at Hope Lodge, next door, rear of St Face Bungalow. I speak for the residents of the lane and the owners at number 10 and 11 St Face Court to the rear of St Face Bungalow and next door to my home. I also speak at the request of Bearsted Views, who own St Face Lane, and the Bearsted and Fenham Society, all represented here. St Face Lane is a privately owned single carriageway lane doubling as a busy public footpath to Roseacre Lane in regular use by adults and children en route to Roseacre and Fenham schools, as well as the tiny tots in Manor Rise, also by dog walkers and others. Parking is not permitted in order to give fire and service vehicles access to the gated development, Bearsted Views, which gateway adjoins the bungalow site. Service vehicles reverse up the lane as there is no hammerhead to turn round. The appellants renewed a planning consent earlier this year for a 4-bedroom, 2-storey family home to replace St Face Bungalow. This was reasonably in keeping with the street scene, was not opposed, and it achieved approval. It could be built promptly with minimal excavation of the site or disruption of the lane access. It also complied with a covenant registered in 2003 to protect what is number 10 and 11 St Face Court behind the site. They now identify instead their wish to maximise the potential of the St Face Lane bungalow by building instead 2 3-floor townhouses on this 0.04738 hectares, very small site, quite the tiniest site in the lane. This would include the excavation of rear lower ground floor lounges. The vehicle space down the side of the site would go, and there would be a development across the whole site, which would be overbearing above numbers 10 and 11 St Face Court, and would also replicate the Bearsted Views roof line into St Face Lane beyond the gated development. Out of keeping with the lane scene and on the highest escarpment in Bearsted, we suggest this could create an inappropriate and unreasonable precedent down St Face Lane. 6 vehicles are identified in place of currently 3, which will be manoeuvred in limited space just outside Bearsted Views gates with no permitted lane parking. We ask members for their support in rejecting this application, which in our view is an overdevelopment of this site, and ask that the approved 4-bedroom house be encouraged to be proceeded with without delay. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Clifford. I call on Councillor Ash of Bearsted Parish Council.
Good evening, Chairman, members and officers. Quite honestly, I think this application says it all. Demolish 1 bungalow and on a restricted site build 2 4-bedroom dwellings on 3 floors. Surely this is cramming at its worst in a low-density area where most properties have substantial curtilages, sufficient for friends and family relations to park without obstructing the lane. The 3rd floor is necessary to squeeze in a double garage to each property because parking on the site will be at a premium and there is no room for off-street parking at this point or anywhere else for visitors. St Face Lane is single track without a footpath. You've just heard that it's a well-used by pedestrians, especially before and after school, as it's a cut through to Roseacre Lane and then through to the Landway, where the primary schools are. It doesn't need further traffic. The development will overlook 10 and 11 St Face Court, which is at a much lower elevation. 1 house on this site would have been fine, but not 2. I ask that you refuse planning permission on the site based on loss of privacy for 2 neighbouring properties, inadequate parking for visitors, highway safety, this is a single track lane with no footpaths, and lastly that the density of the development is too high. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Councillor Ash. Mr Walton for the applicant, please.
Thank you and good evening. My name is Ben Wharton and I am the applicant. I feel that after 3 revised applications, we have addressed all the issues the Planning Office and the neighbours have raised. The land already benefits from a granted application for a 2-storey dwelling, and the current application we are now discussing is no higher, nor is it any closer to the surrounding properties. The site provides more than adequate parking, and the Highways Department has no problem with the proposal. The proposal closely resembles the 2 properties to the rear, i.e. number 10 and 11 St Faith's Court, in both plot size and dwelling size. And as there is a mixed street scene of varying types of houses down St Faith's Lane, the proposal is in keeping. The planning manager has also recommended for approval, so I can't see any valid reasons for refusal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wharton. Councillor Springett.
Good evening, members. I'm really disappointed that this site is being brought before you with a recommendation to approve. This is a quiet, private lane and a very well-used walking route to the infant school. I accept that the properties are mixed in character, but they are spread out, and you can see from the map in the agenda, the general feel of the lane is rural. Despite the officer view that this will not appear an incongruous development, I'm afraid I disagree. 2 townhouses, very close together, squeezed into a small site, are not in keeping with the rest of the lane. I appreciate Bearsted Views is much more intensively built, but it is clearly separated from the lane by a tall wall and electric gates. In addition, although the part of Bearsted Views that is closest to this site also has the appearance of 2 storeys at the front, the ground falls away and they are built on a lower ground level than St Faith's Bungalow. This noticeable difference in ground levels can be seen in the photographs supplied, and in my opinion, this development will appear dominant and out of character for the lane. Whilst I appreciate that the more northerly block is 3 storeys, it is set away from this site. With this proposal being on one of the highest ground levels in the area, these 2 properties will be visible from quite a distance and will be overly dominant to numbers 10 and 11, causing a loss of privacy to those properties as they sit at a significantly lower level. I also have concerns about the parking provision, which is insufficient to allow for visitors, and there's no parking available anywhere nearby. The fact that the garages must remain available for cars indicates that the officer shares those concerns. But as many people use their garages for storage, there is no guarantee that they will be used for cars. That leaves 1 parking space available in front of each house. The approved application has a driveway beside the property which would allow several vehicles to park clear of the lane, but this design doesn't allow for that. There is insufficient turning space for a large vehicle, and I'm not quite sure how they'll manage with construction deliveries or removal vans without actually blocking the lane. Without the facility to turn around, public safety will be an issue, as larger vehicles will have to either reverse into or out of the lane along its entire length. This is a very well-used public right-of-way with no pavements. Although not a planning consideration, there is a covenant on this site restricting development to just 1 property. So even if you approve this application, it's unlikely the 2 houses will ever be built. I ask that you refuse this proposal on the basis of significant harm to the character of the lane, public safety and loss of privacy for neighbouring properties, contrary to paragraph 17 of the NPPF. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. Frodo, Councillor Harwood, did you want the floor first, or I saw your hand up? Okay, it's Councillor English.
I was quite happy with Councillor Harwood to go first. As members will remember, when we had the previous design guidance on distance of residential extensions, if memory serves me right, it was 22 metres. So I'm struggling to justify in my own mind, given the lower height of the building, quite how we could argue that there is a loss of privacy, when under the previous guidance we'd set 22 metres as the absolute maximum where we could actually argue that. That being a different issue than scale, height and mass of buildings, which may well have been addressed, because clearly if you have a building at the same height as, regardless of stories, as a building that has got planning consent, which I believe the applicant said, so that is very hard to argue that that is an unacceptable impact with two buildings, unless the relationship of those two buildings is fundamentally different in some other way than the height and the distance by virtue of there being two of them. That is not necessarily to say that there may not be an issue with street scene, and it's a prominent location. So it then comes down to a question of whether or not, given that it is a prominent location, whether or not the design solution is actually appropriate. That's completely different, of course, than the impact of massing and overdevelopment and privacy on the properties that neighbour it. So I'd be interested, members' comments and officers' views on the appropriateness of the design solution, because frankly, as far as I can see, that's the only particular argument, unless, because I can't see that this is an over-intensive development in the sense that's been argued, and I can't see that the relationship of the properties, given the reduced height, actually has the effect that's been argued. So that leaves the street scene issue.
Councillor Clark.
I was actually going to mention street scene because there's two parts to this lane, and one of them is really quite spacious. You've got a fair amount of space between buildings, and it just, from a character perspective, I just feel that you're losing the rhythm that is there in the street by having these buildings so close together. It really does look like you're trying to absolutely cram something into that site. There is a block further up, but it is set back further. It has a certain design element to it. It doesn't look incongruous. It looks like it has actually been designed in that setting. These two buildings, I'm not sure whether this is appropriate to have such a cramming in this small site.
Councillor Cox, please.
I want one quick question answered, and then I might come back. You showed these two buildings are very close together. Do you have a figure of how close they are together? Because that looks like I could get a Rizzler paper between it, but at the moment I don't think I could get a ladder to do any maintenance to the two buildings. So just a comment back for that, please.
I don't, unfortunately, have a measurement. I think on the elevation drawings, there does appear to be enough room, well, just about, I think, for maintenance.
So it's a metre wide, and they're two metres tall. So how do you get up to go in between to do gutters and stuff like that? Anyway, that's a small part. So we're also saying that we do have permission for one building on here, and that is already in place. Yes? So it seems to me that we've gone, right, one's all right, let's see if we can get two because we can get a bit more money. But I wonder why. So the original building is shown there in red, yes? The original one that has already got planning permission. Okay, thank you. I'll wait and hear what everybody else says. I might come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Jez. I'm sure the case officer will address some points. Can I just, as the members discuss this application, draw members' attention to the refusal 16504496 on page 65. There was a ground of refusal that was cited for a proposal for two-number detached four-bedroom dwellings set on 3 floors. Now, I'm not going to say I know what that design is, but that's quite a crucial material consideration because members refused it on just those grounds. They didn't refuse it on cramming, they didn't refuse it on street scene, it was refused on the principle of overlooking. And I think that's quite a consideration that members need to bear in mind. Whilst this is a separate application, the applicant would have had due regard to that previous decision and would have sought to address that previous ground of refusal. Members need to consider very carefully on this application if they're thinking about additional grounds over and above those issues that weren't raised on that previous refusal. You're now adding in additional grounds that weren't previously there, and then we're straying into different areas. I'll leave it at that for now because I'll come back to that point if that matter is raised, but just wish members to take account of that previous refusal and what it was refused on. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hastings, please.
Thank you. I don't know the area very well, so I'm listening to the views of the Parish Council and the Borough Councillor. There are over 20 objections received, and it's not a huge road from what I gather, so that's quite a lot. The parking provision concerns me, and again the access for emergency vehicles, and more importantly the public safety for children and people walking down the road. I mean, the road's already overcrowded, and we should be encouraging people to walk to school and not discourage them by blocking routes off and making it more hazardous. And that's my only concern.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think this application is fraught with danger. I was intrigued when it came in, and I actually took a visit to see the site myself. And I actually went after work, so it was dark at the time. And I drove up St Faith's Lane. I drove along, and I got as far as Bearsted Views, the gated community. And I thought, well, hold on a minute. This is all, it's pretty spread out. They're all very, very nice houses, in all honesty. And I thought, well, why on earth? This is out of character, as Councillor Clark said, with what was already there. So I thought, OK, well, that's interesting. And then I spent 5 minutes trying to reverse my car out of St Faith's Lane, and I apologise to the neighbours for nearly crashing into their house. And I can see no justification where that problem would be solved by having an additional house here. So that's my first problem. I agree a lot with what Councillor Hastie said about the importance, the strategic importance of this road without a footpath in the network of residents getting to nursery or to primary or primary schools in the area. And I'm very glad that Mr Bailey took us back to the previous reason for refusal, because having read the reports, I don't see anything's changed really from that, from those reasons here. We will still have a loss of privacy to 10 and 11 St Faith's Court, and so I'm really minded, Mr Chairman, to maybe propose an amendment that we refuse permission for this, based on the previous grounds and perhaps anything else that members might want to add.
Mr Chairman, can I come in before to a vote?
Councillor Powell, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Councillor Bolton, I also visited the site on Monday of this week, and I'm absolutely delighted that Councillor Bolton wasn't trying to reverse down the lane when I was there, because there was a couple of ladies with their pushchairs, and given Councillor Bolton's reversing skills, I don't think we would have seen those ladies for much longer. But what I did see while I was there was a few observations. Firstly, there was a Tesco Express van that was there, and he came into the road and he went right to the top, and then he had to reverse all the way back down again. That was just an observation. So yes, there's an element of danger, but the danger is at the junction where you come into St Faith's Lane, you're on a blind bend. And how there hasn't been a casualty, or maybe there has been a casualty there, I don't know. I also did my own test, which was to actually stand opposite this bungalow and try to imagine what a detached single property would look like. And it would completely take away any privacy that was with the house opposite. I don't know whether that was 10, 11, I didn't I didn't see a number on the property. So I would have been minded that if you're going to do anything, you do like for like. You know, personally speaking, I would even have concerns about a detached property, given that the privacy that the house that was built opposite. But it's just totally, you've got to be there to see it. It is completely the wrong location. I personally believe this application is being driven by money and no other reason.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, can I also say that I'd also second Councillor Borton as well, if he proposes that.
So we have a proposer and a seconder, I think. Councillor Mumford, please.
Very quickly, my concerns are, as brought up by the visiting members, parking. I think Councillor English suggested that this was not an overdevelopment of the site. I'm looking at the red line. There's not a lot more that I can get on that site. So I believe it is an overdevelopment of the site. I have lost the driveway, which would have given me visitor parking. I have concerns about the privacy, and moreover, I think it is the street scene that will be affected most. Now, you're referring me back to why we refused the last time. I take every planning application on its own merits, and I say that we should be looking at the street scene and possibly overdevelopment. So I would ask Councillor Borton to relook at his proposal, and I suggest that design would not fit in with the street scene. I'd like to see something in parking and the loss of the driveway.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Councillor Byrne, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just going to ask for some clarity on something that Councillor English said earlier, because just from looking at the elevations there, I don't think it takes an Einstein or even a ruler to see that you do have an invasion of privacy and overlook onto the properties behind. But you made some mention of some guidelines of a 22-metre area. So my question is, whilst I would be minded to take the privacy issue into account here, do we open ourselves up to potential recourse for appeal because we're going against our own guidelines on that issue?
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. It was following on from Clive's point, which was made well. I do think that if we're going to move this, we should be looking at the street scene, the rhythm of the street, because I do think that it's jarring just to look at those buildings on the plan, and I do think that we should be mentioning the fact that this is incongruous because of these two buildings right next door, which is not in character with this lane.
Thank you. Councillor English.
Yes, I think members have got to start, being sensible about this. I'm sorry, there's no other way around it. There is no fundamental difference in the parking, in the safety issue with one house or two houses. It's the same issue. No, sorry. And because consent has been granted for one house, that if there was a safety issue, it should have been done then. It hasn't been done. Now, the residential guidance, no, you've got to be sensible about this, members. Planning has to be consistent, and we have to actually address those issues that can be addressed. 22 metres was the old guidance, and we, as an authority, took that as beyond that distance, there was no question of privacy being incurred. What we could, and there is, I think, a strong argument for saying that there is a street scene issue here. And that, as my colleague Councillor Clark says, this development interrupts the rhythm of the street by the very nature of the spacing of the properties. Now, it so happens that in many ways the spacing of the properties is dictated by the size of the site. But That's no doubt. But it is, in my personal opinion, quite possible to argue that there is a street scene issue here. There is no way, given the reduction in the height and the previous decision, that you can actually argue the privacy issue and the overbearing issue that was in the previous refusal. And historically and currently, the Secretary of State and the Planning Inspectorate are not responding well to issues of simply saying a site is overdeveloped or too crammed. They're looking for the harm that does. The harm this does, in terms of the site being crammed, is it ruins the street scene, because that naturally leads to an unsympathetic gap between the properties in the street, and therefore the application should be refused because it is incongruous in the street scene, and we can make that argument. But if we make any other argument, we're just weakening the case, and we're opening the door for a weaker decision and a potential appeal, if not against the decision, against those grounds, because frivolous grounds can be appealed against and overturned with a costs award, even if the application refusal stands. So I would urge members to actually use the ground we might actually win on, rather than add lots and lots of grounds because we happen to think we don't like something.
Thank you, Councillor English. I'm going to hand over to Mr. Bailey, who will, I'm sure, have a few comments.
What the councillor has just said. Obviously, Kent Design Guide, which first introduced the privacy distance, that was the one that Clive was referring to as a rather old guide. The current guide that's adopted doesn't actually have a privacy distance, and it uses design to mitigate against design. So we couldn't actually set a benchmark to a standard, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. But what I would just refer members back to is we have approved a scheme of a single dwelling in a similar location. Okay, it's one dwelling, which has a similar privacy distance. So that has to be borne into mind, that that is already there. So, okay, you're adding another dwelling in. That's two dwellings, but you've got to bear in mind that there's already a dwelling on the site with, or approved on the site, with a similar distance in terms of the overlooking issue. So that was accepted previously. So members, please bear that in mind. And again, I have to sort of draw you back to previous grounds of refusal and what Councillor English said. Consistency is a key element. I totally get that you need to determine each application on its individual merits, but likewise, when your officers are defending appeals, and for consistency of members of the public, they see a ground of refusal, they seek to address it. It's a material consideration when you're considering the application. Have they addressed the previous grounds of refusal? Now, members start adding in new grounds. It's what we call, and I previously raised this and I think I got chastised for it, it's called unreasonable behaviour in terms of cost issues. I'll kind of withdraw back from that, but the reasons why that's considered unreasonable behaviour, and I use that in the context of appeals, not the way members are making decisions, I use that on the basis that an applicant has an expectation that they have a reasonable understanding of knowing what their application was refused on. In this case, the applicant clearly had an understanding what the ground of refusal was, i.e. overlooking. They've sought to address that. Now, members may consider that they haven't done it, but they've sought to address it. If new grounds are added, that's where we get into this problem about your officers having to defend those decisions and inspector saying, well, it wasn't refused on there previously. Is it reasonable to refuse it now? There were two dwellings, except on a different design. Design wasn't a ground of refusal, nor was street scene character, nor was highway access, nor were any of those other issues. So I think members just need to bear that in mind when they make the decision moving forward. And if the officer's got anything else to add to that, then I'll let you make your decision.
Thank you, Chairman. Gauging the feeling around the room, maybe the privacy route isn't the route that we will eventually go down, but would there be the possibility, because I'm still not convinced by the images of the elevation that we've seen, that it does actually address the concerns of overlooking the properties behind. Is there the possibility that we could add a condition to this application that would insist on perhaps a substantial hedgerow that would go into place? I'm just, call it my inexperience if you like, but I'm just trying to think of ways that we could block out the view into the properties behind.
An option that members could do, if members weren't happy with what they've got, they could, if they wish to say, is defer the application. We could go back to the applicant to see if they're prepared to look at a design which tried to design out those overlooking issues to a greater extent. The applicant may not agree with that, and then the application would come back to members on the basis of what they've got. But I think the applicant would have a clear indication of what the concerns of members are, as long as they're clearly identified tonight. If it is the issue that they haven't overcome the ground, they could decide to refuse the application, or, and I don't normally say this because, members have got an application to determine in front of them, so they could quite rightly decide to determine that. But as I've said before, the guidance didn't introduce specific meterage because you should be able to design out overlooking, and that's why they took it out, because they didn't want this prescriptive 21 metres, 22 metres in every scenario. That's why they took it out and they said design it out. Hopefully that answers your question, Councillor.
Councillor Powell, please, and then we'll try and get...
Mr Chairman, I might be seeing this completely wrong, but this is a completely different application to what we had last time. And that the members talking tonight, and I think most of the members are actually in agreement about the street scene and one or two other bits and pieces. This may not have even been brought forward at the last meeting. We've actually got a proposal on the table tonight. Whatever that is, or the wording of it, I still think we should go ahead with that.
Thank you, Councillor Powell. That actually is what I intend to do, because we have a proposal, I think.
Can we clarify the proposal, please?
I will ask, do you want to, as a proposal?
I was intending on going with the reasons for refusal from last time. However, on reflection and having listened to the debate, I am minded, because ultimately I want to get this refused, because I think for a variety of reasons, and I think this would do it. But I think that the street scene argument, perhaps some wording along the lines of the fact that the proposal interrupts the rhythm of the street by what Councillor Carter just said, basically. I think that would gain more favour around the room, perhaps, Mr. Chairman. Look, I stand by what I said earlier, but having listened to the debate, I think that's a stronger form of words that the committee would be happier with.
Can you?
I think I can pick it up. I would ask that in order to tighten it up, I get delegated authority on that basis, or the head of planning does. But I think it's what you're concerned is the proposals by virtue of the loss of spaciousness between the buildings harms the rhythm of the street scene, and therefore harms, in terms of context, harms the character of the context of the immediate locality, contrary to the aims of MPPF paragraphs XXXX, 60, 59 and such like. I think that's what members are seeking. Are you also seeking the issue of the overlooking issues to the neighbouring dwellings, or not?
I think we should keep it simple, actually. Yeah, and that's a winning situation. Yeah. Okay. Councillor Powell, are you happy with that as well as the seconder? Yeah. Councillor Harwood, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. I've been listening with interest to the debate. I am a little concerned about using as a ground for refusal a rhythm, because this Street is arrhythmic. It's an eclectic mix, and that's part of its charm in that it has different size units of different ages, and some with big hedges and trees and gardens, others more open. But it has a character, it has a sense of place, and I would much rather that we reflected the point that Mr. Bailey made around the fact that the character is a spacious character. There are domestic gardens and domestic curtilages. By introducing a very hard landscaped, densely developed block as we're proposing here, that will be alien to the overall character. But I think we would be a little wide of the mark to talk about a rhythm, because there isn't one. What there is there is an overarching character within St Faith's Lane. And I think the reason why this is really critical is that there is a permission on this site for quite a large unit. But because it is one unit, there is still the space there to enclose it within a garden. Therefore, it retains a key character motif of St Faith's Lane. So I would like us to, I don't want to go over it again, but it's character, not rhythm, because there isn't one. Yeah.
I think we could substitute character.
If we substitute character for rhythm, Mr. Chairman, I think that's the most consensus we'll get around the room, to be honest.
And just to add, members have taken account of my advice on the other part. I'm sure they have. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
If I may come back on that, I think the point that you're talking about, the previous application was for a single unit, so therefore it still had a garden, so therefore this character jarring did not occur. And I think that's where we can make the fine grain of argument that this is different, therefore a different ground for refusal can be utilised.
Right. So can I have a show of hands on the proposal?
Delegated authority.
Yeah. I think we've got his name on it. It's unanimous. I like that. Okay. Are you happy with that, James?
Yes, we're taking the second application.
I'm happy
Yeah.
to. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Don't worry. I'm going to suggest it's past 8, isn't it? I think maybe we should have a cup of coffee or tea or bananas or whatever for
Bananas would be good.
for at least 15 minutes.